All right, guys, welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to Theory and Theology. On this podcast, we talk about traditions and culture and spirituality and religion. I'm about to expose my complete ignorance about paganism and Wiccan culture. Brace yourself. I'm in the process of learning. I think last year near Halloween, I did an episode about maybe like the Celtic history, something along those lines. And I can't believe it's already near that time of year again. And so, I usually am, diving into a lot of biblical history, but I was listening to some of Henry Abramson's history, kind of about the early development of the Christian church, how it came out of Judaism near the year 300-ish, after the Council of Nicaea, and was officially no longer considered like a part of Judaism. But throughout the history of Judaism and Christianity, you often see that Christians and Jews are sharing society with pagan people. Now I'm gonna be honest here. I try my best not to be prejudiced against people. I don't know many people that identify as pagan. I've known a couple people in my life that identified as Wiccan. I've never specifically met a person who was either pagan or Wiccan and seemed like they were hateful or evil or anything along those lines. So I think to myself, I think like, I know people who believe in voodoo, practices, and how that's kind of looked upon a little bit negatively in Western society. I feel like paganism and Wiccan culture is also kind of negatively looked upon by a lot of mainstream Western culture, mostly because I'm guessing it's because of how a lot of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim culture is generally like, well, they don't believe in this single God, belief. And a lot of times those books, are often like saying things like, the scripture that those religions read is usually saying, don't do the stuff that they're doing. Stay away from it. Don't do it. But I know that when I've read in the Old Testament about like, I'm not very up to date on things, but things like Ashdod and like I think they're called like Asherim, like the pillars, sacred pillars and things like that. I believe that comes from something pagan related. But I often wonder why there's so much prejudice when I don't think I know anybody who straight up has a different religion or belief system that I've ever met and been like, oh, this person and their beliefs are complete trash. I've never really felt that way, in all honesty. Usually I'm, at the very least, pretty curious. At the very most, I'm like, oh, this person's really different, and I want to kind of learn about their background and stuff. Like, not to be nosy, but like I get very excited when I meet people who are different from me. I'm like, this is cool, but I know that, growing up in a Christian religion, we're usually taught about the evils of all this kind of stuff, of, people who have a veneration and honor for their ancestors, or any form of anything that looks like ancestor worship. It's a very common thing in a lot of cultures, though, like ancestor worship, veneration for ancestors. That's super common, for people to have like shrines. I'm not even talking paganism specifically. I'm thinking even in Buddhism and Hinduism, in different sorts of cultures, people having shrines of their deceased loved ones. I've heard about some cultures, I can't remember the specific culture, but it was an Asian culture, I believe, where they would have it's kind of like a mummified, like dead person, and they would come I guess it was every year, to this dwelling where they would kind of house these, I guess they're technically mummies, and they would kind of like clean up their region, and I don't know, it wasn't really like repairing, but they would like stay there a while and like be in the presence of these physical remains of their like grandparents, great grandparents, people even before that, and they had like these bodies like in these kind of like dwellings, like up on hills or up in like caves and little like kind of like housings, and it would cost so much money every time somebody died to make one of these things and to house them and keep them in there. And I had never seen or heard of anything like that before I came across that documentary, but it definitely piqued my interest. And I know a lot of cultures that have like totem, like the totem poles, I guess that's what they're classically called, of just like, it's different types of like ancestor representations throughout their like tribal or cultural history. Just a lot of stuff along those lines, right? So it's like, I don't really think, I feel like the people, the traditions almost that don't look into, a time period to kind of reflect on like the ancestors, that seems more to be kind of rare. I think a lot of cultures actually do look at their ancestors, and at the very least they'll have like candles or incense or like something, representative. So that's just one of the many things. And so, I'm kind of like exposing my own ignorance, because for some reason, during this season, during this time period of the year, once October rolls around, I start getting very like cautious, of a lot of things, feeling like I don't want to be exposed to too much of the negativity about the dead and about just that kind of topic. All right, so where to go? I hope the beginning segment recorded. I'm gonna try and listen to it and check But okay, so far I've been studying about paganism and heathenry, and one thing I'm noticing is that I definitely know nothing. So I can tell you the perspectives that I've learned before diving into any content other than some of the stuff about like the history of Halloween. So 2021 I was pretty interested in Halloween. Now that it's 2022, near that season again, I find myself kind of thinking more about an overall worldview of this type of season. So naturally, paganism kind of came to my mind, because like I was mentioning, there's not really a Christian holiday necessarily in October. And I find it fascinating that as much as Christianity incorporates pagan tradition, it doesn't teach about paganism. It teaches pretty much the opposite. Usually words like pagan and heathen are associated with just negative, bad Satanists and witches. Now, I like even just those terms, they're like loaded terms, right? It's like in society where I live, if you say that kind of stuff, if you call somebody those kind of labels, you're kind of placing a lot of judgment on a person, assuming that they're evil, having bad intentions, trying to get over on people, don't have any values or morals or anything. One thing that I found interesting is the guy whose videos I'm listening to, his channel is called The Wisdom of Odin, and he mentions that there's not a lot of written material for Norse pagan rituals and like spiritual practices before Christianity came in. Another thing that I kind of noticed that always interested me is that, in the Bible, you hear over and over again in the Bible, in the Old Testament especially, what I would view as like a prejudice kind of method of handling things. But you hear a lot of you hear this a lot, the terminology of like Asherim, sacred poles. This guy in his videos talks about God poles, or God, like trees. Basically, carvings made out of like trees of like a god, and they're like sacred poles. You hear that kind of wording a lot in the Bible, but the only time you hear it is when they're saying to the Jews, when you go into their land, smash their sacred pillars, cut down their sacred trees, but these are basically like handmade, carved out idol deities that get worshipped either in like a sacred grove or certain like pillars that are used in like a household, or from like generations, like keeping like a maybe like a, for example, he was mentioning like a tree, like a large like tree that would be used as like a household pillar that would have carvings of these gods in them. And people would travel, like when they would travel, they would, if they were moving to like other lands, they would take these with them sometimes because they meant that much to them. Or maybe, it was something that they had in their generations, like multiple generations of maybe someone who carved that, or some god that their family worships. Like, it doesn't sound like they're just carving these gods all day, every day. Like, they probably have meaning to them. And so that's something that really stuck out to me, that I was always wondering, like they, in Christian faith, in Jewish faith, it's like go into these villages and basically just like destroy all of their religious idols, their religious things that they worship, their altars, all these kinds of things. And I'm thinking about it and I'm like, that's so hateful, like it's just so hateful. And I was never raised to have like idols, because being raised Christian, you just don't have idols. Like, that's not even a thing. Like, we didn't even have like the Virgin Mary or Jesus statues or anything like that. Like, the closest I would say that we might have is like a cross on a necklace, like maybe, if that, of anything, if that, maybe. But we also weren't really raised around having like a lot of jewelry and stuff, so we didn't really have anything that you would sit towards worshiping. Like, you might have, I remember when I used to go to church all the time, I would usually carry a Bible with me because I was pretty attached to my own Bibles and liked visually seeing what was being read about in the version that I liked reading. I never cared if it was on the screen or whatever. And back then I didn't really use like a smartphone as a Bible or anything like that. But, I liked my biblical books, my Bibles, my other types of books. So I can't imagine if somebody were to come into my space and destroy my Bibles or destroy like even like my musical instruments or something like that. It's just like, yeah, that's just the ultimate like middle finger or worse. It's like you're not really making friends by doing that. But what I find interesting is how paganism made its way into Christianity after Christianity split from Judaism. And so much so to a point that, modern day Christianity in Western society, in American culture overall, the mainstream Christianity looks nothing like Judaism. Like, the holidays aren't the same thing. We're not following a lunar calendar. There's a lot more similarity to paganism. Yet, I can't tell you ever when I learned a thing about paganism, ever. Not even in church. They never even teach you about it. We were taught about the Sabbath and about how the Sabbath has a we were taught about how the Sabbath comes from Judaism, and how that's the reason why the denomination I was, worshiping in had pretty much, they would go to, Friday sundown, the Saturday sundown would be the worshiping, not that you can only worship then, but you would worship then at church. I've probably mentioned before that we never went to Sunday churches, not necessarily I'm just saying, like, as an Adventist church, you don't go to Easter Sunday service, for example. Like, we would have a service during the Sabbath, and then we wouldn't even go to church on Sunday. And because I think the reason why is because there's so much of a stigma against, going to church on a Sunday, because that's like the day of worship of, pagan day of worship. And so it's basically, the way I see it, is just culture clashes, but people using their religion combined with politics when they're, at war. And when in Christianity, when they started converting people who were not Jewish, they were basically converting who would be considered Gentiles, which are non-Jewish people, and allowing them to become Christian, meaning, there were a lot of those traditional Jewish rules that Henry Abramson was talking about. There's a lot of those traditional Jewish laws that were not followed by modern day Christians, modern as in after the Council of Nicaea, after 300 something, after 300 AD-ish, it was sometime in the 300s, and so, once the, so basically, paganism is, the Norse paganism that he speaks of here in the wisdom of Odin. And Odin is the god that he worships. It's a deity. There's another one that's Thor. There's another one that he carved a, like the idol out of part of the tree. It was kind of like a tree stump. Is that the right word? Like, it wasn't very, very thick, but it was like a thin kind of tree trunk. Probably about, I'd say about 8 inches in diameter or so. It looked like it was about 2.5, maybe 2 feet tall. And, so he was carving this thing. And it was a female goddess. I can't remember the name, like something with a V, like Vaya or something. I can't remember the name. But anyways, just seeing, like some of the early stuff that I'm learning about here with how he talks about the types of people that might join and how people might join, basically just people who worship a heathen god that's considered to be practicing heathenry. He was mentioning, like, there's no, like, written paperwork, there's no kind of other thing that you have to do. if you worship that way, then that's what you are, pretty much. And I just think I just think it's just an interesting, belief system. It's pretty different from Christianity. I mean, Christianity is very book heavy, very like, this is what you're taught, but also a lot of, like, traditionally Christians don't tend to spend a whole lot of time reading the Bible, and usually the perspective from the ones who do read it is usually that it's the ultimate word of God, and everything written in there was inspired by God, and you can't challenge it, you can't change it, you can't do anything with it. Nothing outside of that book is as important as that book, and nothing, like, not really the book itself, but more so what's in the book, what's being taught in the book, what people learn from reading the book. Any other belief system that doesn't adhere to what it says in the book is considered negative, wrong, incorrect, don't do any other thing any other way. And so, even just looking at the 10 Commandments, the first commandment is, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, mind. The second commandment, not making any idols or graven images. That's already up there on the list, and it's one of the first things that it seems like is coming up in, learning about paganism, is that they do have idols, and that's something I've never really been too familiar with. It's just beliefs about idols. I mean, sometimes in Christianity you'll see people with prayer beads, or, like I mentioned, like a cross. I know in Catholicism sometimes they have what are those things? Those, like, saint, like, I don't know what they're called. They look like a little coin on a necklace, kind of. Like a flat little, like, saint whoever, like saint this person. People will, like, wear them around their neck. But yeah, I've never seen, other than, like, maybe the Virgin Mary statues, or, like, candles, or, like those cards. I don't think other Christian denominations have really any kind of visual anything other than the book of the Bible, or maybe like a necklace with a cross on it, or some kind of jewelry with a cross on it or something. Usually you don't really even see, other than when Christmas comes around, you'll see maybe like baby in the manger kind of things, like a baby Jesus, or the nativity scene with little statues, but those aren't considered like idols. Like, nobody sits and, like, worships it. They might reflect on it or sing and think about it and stuff, but even with the Christmas tree, nobody's worshiping the tree. And with the songs and everything, like, there's no, like, item being, like, used as, like, a focus of worship towards it or anything. So that's a really different and having the multiple gods. Like, this guy's already brought up like 3 or 4 gods within his practice, and I'm not trying to judge it. I just don't know what it is. Like, I'm kind of learning about it still. And so, I mean, I've never even seen these things in my life up until today. Like, I've never seen them depicted. I've never looked into it. I've just heard about, you can think about, like, reading the Bible and having read it since I was a kid. And there's always these, like, passages that are like, what the heck does that even mean? Like, smash their sacred poles and their... Oh, it's like, what? Like, what's sacred poles? Like, that was never something that I had, like, an image of, like, what is actually happening. What are you actually smashing? Not me, but, like, what were these people during these historical wars going into these villages and destroying? They were destroying the religion of these people and their gods that they carved idols of, that they worshipped at altars and different sacred spaces. They were basically destroying those representations of those gods. Like, they don't believe that, I don't think pagans believe that the actual idol itself is like an actual god. I don't think they believe that. I think it's more of like a representation. I could be wrong, but I don't think that they believe that. The reason why I say that I don't think they believe that is because if you can go carve multiple ones, if you could find like trunks of trees or whatever and like carve multiple deities of multiple Thors, multiple Odins, it's kind of like that doesn't make sense, right? Like, it sounds like, if you believe in that deity, you would have the idol of that deity and you could worship it at the altar or wherever the sacred groves were, where they would keep the god, did he call them god poles or the sacred poles or sacred pillars or whatever they're called in the Bible. And so I mean, I can find beauty in everything almost, and I do like the idea of altars. I've always liked that idea of altars. I don't own an altar. I don't really have a specific altar. I do have like a space where I keep certain things that I would say are of a significant importance to me for specific reasons, in a spiritual way, in a personal development way. I'm not really going to explain that in much more detail, but I would think too, when I move, that I would have at least a shelf or a section or a table where I would put all those things at. I could see that happening. I wouldn't call it an altar. I wouldn't sit and like worship at it, but it would be more like a reflection type of area. And if I found more types of items that I would want to add to that display collection, I would put them in that certain spot with the other things, but I wouldn't see myself worshiping it, like asking it for any kind of forgiveness or asking it or talking to it about anything. And I'm not saying it's wrong for people to do that. I'm just saying, like, the specific things that I'm thinking about, I don't consider them gods, or even a representation of God, of any kind of God. Some of them have like a spiritual significance to them, but other than that, not like a God specific thing. Maybe some types of scripture, scrolls and things like that, but yeah, it's kind of how I'd say I would think about it. So he explained kind of some other things too, that are pretty different, like the ancestor worship, or that type of practice near certain kind of holidays. But I'm really fascinated with it because it's like, Christianity has incorporated so much of this actual pagan religion into it, but it's like just dabbling, you know what I mean? It's like treat them like they're evil, don't accept their ways, but we're gonna celebrate all the same holidays. It's kind of very confusing, because on the one hand it's like stay away, don't do what they do, everything they do is wrong, stay prejudiced against them. But then, the major days of commemoration and celebration and festivity throughout the year that you look forward to with family and friends, and those big moments where they're even like nationally recognized and everything is closed so people can go celebrate these things, they're pagan. And so, I mean, everybody, even non-religious people, are celebrating pagan holidays. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm not. It's just also even weirder. It's even weirder when you live in a place like Southern California, where there's not really snow other than in the mountains a little bit of the year. A lot of it's man-made snow too, but there's not really a lot of snow in places where you're actually at. You can go to the beach all year long. I'm thinking about going to the beach tomorrow after work, actually. Yeah, you can go to the beach all the time. When fall and winter comes, you notice the seasons change, the days are shorter, but you don't quite notice you don't quite notice like every single seasonal type of thing. Like all the kind of Christmassy imagery that you get from paganism culture, about like things that you hear that are still even in our culture today, like the Yule tidings, and things about like sleigh bells, and things about like definitely Christmas, and the fiery vibe of Christmas, and the Christmas tree, and the gifts, and the food, the feasting, indoors, like with the warm fire going, and it's snowy outside, and that kind of thing. Like it's there's just really not a lot of that in mainstream Christianity. There is a lot of that in mainstream Christianity, but just not in this part of the world. Like, we don't think about snow. It's not part of the culture here. But he was saying, Norse paganism comes from, Scandinavian tribal traditions. And when you think of it, a lot of tribal traditions are similar in their own ways. There is an interesting thing that I noticed is that some tribes of people in the world, especially in the ancient world, some believed in more than one god, some believed in just one. A lot of them have these themes of like creators. Those are just common themes you see of different groups that are all over the place. But my goal with all this is to really learn more about kind of not to make it negative, but more about kind of like the prejudice that I was raised around. Like, I wouldn't say my parents raised me like that. Like, I don't ever remember anybody in my house ever talking about pagans at all. I think I was the one who introduced the idea of reverting somewhat back to a Jewish tradition, and not really, celebrating so much of Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, Halloween, that kind of stuff. And, because at a certain point I was like, well, if Sunday church is considered not okay by Adventism, and that's just one day out of the week, what about all these other holidays? When you start reading in the Bible where it talks about this is a Sabbath and treat this as a Sabbath, and you're like, well, what's the difference between the seventh day Sabbath every week and this other Sabbath that's, this other holiday that's considered a Sabbath, that kind of thing. So I kind of like what I'm learning, but I'm not sure how easy it's going to be to piece together. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of bits and pieces. He's already talking about stuff I don't know, and a lot of symbolism and imagery and items that I'm just like, I have no idea what these things would be for. Different instruments, bones, different types of stones, crystal looking things. I've just got so much to learn about, and I also think it's cool to learn about because it's like, well, these paths were definitely crossing, these cultural paths were definitely crossing with the cultural paths of the religion I grew up in, and so much so that it talked about their gods in the Christian scriptures. I just didn't know what they were. Like, I kind of knew what those like sacred pillars were and that kind of stuff, but I'd never seen one. I'd never heard of anybody talk about it. Like, he showed like different photographs of like old types of pictures and that people had taken, like from like really extravagant, like four-headed or four-sided, gigantic large tree, kind of like it didn't have the branches or any of the foliage or leaves, nothing like that. It was just the trunk of the tree, just carved all in it. It's basically a sculpture, pretty much. It was like a sculpture in a tree. It could be that extravagant all the way down to like a little kind of nub that just had like a couple eye holes and a little mouth carved out, not even with a lot of detail, but just representative of something. And I just find it fascinating, like a lot of times when, I don't know, I'm not trying to sound like racist, but a lot of times when I talk to different races and ethnicities of people, right, I talk to different Asian groups of people, and a lot of them can kind of talk about the history of their people before Western civilization touched them and how their culture looked and things like that. When I talk to my Latino friends, they have a lot of that kind of heritage and culture going back to different like indigenous roots. When I talk to, a lot of people who are Black people that have maybe Caribbean or African ancestry that they know about, the ones who kind of know where their lineage is from, or maybe adopted like Christianity or Islam, and kind of like go more with that history of those religions or other types of beliefs. or things that they kind of delve into. And then just all kinds of like Pacific Islander groups of people, and just all different types of people. I usually notice that a lot of people can connect somewhat to like a tribal history, even if they don't practice it themselves, like they know of it, right? One thing that's always interested me a bit is that whenever I talk to my Caucasian friends, a lot of them don't really identify with a tribal history at all. I feel like they're almost the only group that, when I talk to them, other than maybe like African American Black people, because not all of them, but some of them might not know too far back into their history because of slavery. I mean, that's plenty of people. There are plenty of people who don't know their ancestry because of different reasons, not just African Americans. But I feel like my Jewish white friends usually trace back their tribal history to, the Hebrews, the Israelites. But a lot of other white friends kind of don't. They seem to just stop at when people came to the U.S. Like, once we came to the U.S., we were just this different type of non-tribal person, and that's where we start. That's kind of the impression I get from them sometimes. Like, they might be German background or Welsh background or whatever kind of background, but they oftentimes don't seem very connected with like a tribal root, or even seem to care about it or think about it or learn about it. At least the way they describe it, I've never ever, like, usually what I hear people say is, oh, I don't have a culture, or like, that's usually what I've heard people say. They're not like too often, it's just not regular that I hear them, talking about those connections. If they are connected, I've never heard them talk about it when I've asked. So I do kind of like seeing this tribal Scandinavian Norse pagan culture, because it is like a Caucasian tribal culture, religion, spiritual practices, traditions. I like seeing it because it's like, oh yeah, like this is where some of the white people came from. They would have been potentially doing some things like this in their history. And then, there were different groups of people coming in trying to destroy their history. And so I just find it interesting how different groups talk about different things, but it's always been something that I've wanted to just like sit and talk to somebody. I'm not saying I don't like Jewish people. I love Jewish people, but those are the only people that I've ever talked to that were white people that would talk about, ancient historical kind of like background and stuff. Like, usually I think all my other non-Jewish white friends don't really talk about like tribal things at all. Maybe they don't know, maybe they don't think about it, maybe it's not important to them. I don't know. I don't even know what to think. I don't know why. It's always just baffled me as to like why I never hear people talk about those things. Especially because I know so many people from so many different cultures, and they're the only group of people that, I never hear them say like, oh, like, my great grandparents back in wherever were like this other religion before other people converted to Christianity or whatever. So I don't know. It's just a curious thing on my end, and I'm enjoying learning. It's very uplifting, fascinating, connecting a lot of cultural dots that I've kind of been curious about for like years. just sad to kind of think about, that something that's such a beautiful culture with these traditions would be, people would come in and destroy it because of their other religion that said to like destroy that religion because their God said to destroy it. And so it's like, that's pretty heavy. And like I mentioned, I've never befriended pagans. Like, I've never known pagans. Like, maybe I should go to a meetup and like try and meet some local pagans. I don't really know, but I've never really I've never been adverse to like any religion overall. Like, with my Muslim friends, I love learning about Islam. Buddhist friends, Hindu friends, like I've never been able to I went to a Hindu worship area, but I don't know if it was some kind of a temple like in Malibu. I don't know if it's actually like a temple where people go to worship. It seemed like they had some kind of services or traditions happening while I was there. My friend wanted to sit and listen and watch what was happening, and I wasn't comfortable because I was like feeling like, okay, we're in some other religious space, and I don't really I wasn't at a point in my life where I was open to different types of practices. I was still really trying to do how I was raised, and living alone. I was trying to keep towards those types of beliefs, but yeah, I'm gonna keep learning. I'll see if there's more that I'm gonna record. This is already pretty lengthy, so I hope I hit on a lot of topics on here, but that's kind of mostly initially what's going through my mind as I'm coming across this initial material. This new to me is kind of like I'm also going back through my mind of like the questions I've had in the past, and kind of like different kind of cultural questions that were never answered because I was reading things from a very one-sided perspective. I was never delving into the history of these other groups that were being in the history of these wars and stuff that were happening, these religious wars, these culture wars, and so yeah. So with that, hopefully this is interesting, and thanks for listening.